Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Today I wanted to talk about the Magicka Warden. First off, big thanks to Wrath of Enos for letting me share this setup and parse with you guys. He came up with a really nice static rotation that uses a lot of dot abilities that got him just under 101k DPS. He didn't get a combat metrics report saved, but fortunately he did log it on ESO logs, so we can dive into the setup that he used there, and I'll have it linked in the description below as well for anyone that wants to dig through it. So for this video, I'll go through the basics of setting up your Warden, a few different build possibilities, and then end with a few parses on the trial dummy. The first of those being from Wrath of Enos. And then real quick before we get started, if you want to keep up with what I'm working on and generally up to in life, make sure to give my Twitter page a follow. Alright, let's get into it. So for the top races, there were several changes made to the racial rebalancing this patch, so I used UESP to put this comparison chart together. So make sure to check out their build editor if you haven't already, it's a pretty great tool. So a few notes here. High Elf, Dark Elf, and Khajiit are all within 1% of each other, regardless of the scenario. High Elf is on top except with the Thief with daggers, and High Elf also passes Khajiit with daggers at 100% major force uptime. Khajiit seems to slightly pass High Elf in most scenarios when backstabber cannot be slotted for that 15% crit damage. If you're going vampire, Khajiit passes High Elf with only 2 to 3 stacks of Simmering Frenzy depending on your setup. Khajiit's Feline Ambush passive boosts enchantment damage as well, since enchantments can crit, so no other racial passives will be boosting those. And then Khajiit's Resource plus Recovery passives make them just slightly the most appealing to me. So the gap between the top 3 is the smallest it's ever been, the gap between the top to the bottom is the smallest it's ever been, and really any of the top few options are going to do great. So I'll leave this chart up here for the Mundus stone comparison between the Thief and the Shadow as well. I think for most of the popular gear setups, you can't really go wrong with either one, but Thief seems to be a little bit more versatile. At 50% major force uptime, Shadow does seem to be better than the Thief. And then at 100% major force uptime, Thief becomes better than the Shadow for staves. So which one is better than the other will change a bit based on your crit chance and your crit damage, so uptimes on different buffs and debuffs are going to play into which one is better. I think the Thief is probably the safer bet for most stuff though, and seems better on the trial dummy as well due to the 100% major force uptime. And these comparisons are made with what I'd guess you'd call the meta gear setup, so it could switch back and forth again based on what you're wearing specifically. Okay, for the food and drink options, with the increase in base health, the Ghastly Eyeball drink option will no longer be just for practicing on the dummy and will be more viable in actual content. Just be careful, you will be a little bit more squishy with that over the standard health plus Magicka food. And if your sustain is okay, I'd definitely try and stick with that Bystat food. The Clockwork Citrus option is okay as well if you need some recovery but are worried about the health pool. It isn't quite as much damage as the other two options, but isn't far off. And then finally, if your sustain is really good and you don't mind being a little squishy, the green food that boosts Magicka only will be the most damage. It isn't by a lot, but does slightly outperform the health plus Magicka food. Probably not enough extra damage to warrant giving up the extra health, but if you're feeling pretty confident, then go for it. For our potions, for most scenarios, you'll probably still use the standard spell power potions. However, you can use the heroism pots if you have inner light double barred, which will allow you to cast your bear ultimate a little more frequently, but just keep in mind these potions are really expensive. Alright, now I'll go through the gear. I'll go through some non-trial gear options here in a bit as well, but as always, these will all be down in the description if you want to dig through them. This first setup is the one that seems to get the best results overall. Wrath used it in his nearly 101k parse, and I also used it in one of my 96k parses. So we're going with Mother Sorrow, Siroria, and Zon with the Maelstrom Inferno staff on the back bar. Daggers do seem to be slightly better than a staff for our front bar if you can stand in melee range for the whole fight. It is very close though, and having an Inferno staff front bar is still a great option and probably will be used in more fights than daggers. But nevertheless, if you can stand in melee, daggers are a tad bit stronger. The jewels and body pieces are interchangeable here since we are running 2 lightweight sets. And if you don't have perfected Siroria, it isn't a big deal. It's only about a 1% DPS loss. So we're running all light gear. This is great this patch because you can hit the penetration cap of 18,200 without Alkosh. Make sure to check out the Tank Club's chart on penetration if you're wondering how much you need to bring to your group. For the traits, all divines on the body, bloodthirsty on the jewelry, infused on the back bar, and if it's a staff front bar, it'll be precise, and if it's daggers, you can go precise, or Nern precise. I honestly haven't been able to tell a difference in the damage from either of those. For the enchantments, all max magicka on the body, spell damage on the jewels, frozen and poison on the dual wield, and flame on the inferno staff. For a bit more AoE damage, you can run flame and poison on the dual wield and weapon damage on the staff. And if no one in your group is applying chilled, running the frozen enchantment on your back bar can benefit your personal DPS since you get a 10% bonus to your crit damage to chilled enemies. Now this is separate from the brittle debuff. Remember, brittle does need an ice staff to be applied, but chilled does not. So speaking of chilled, there has been a lot of talk about running ice staves on a warden DPS and being in charge of brittle duty. It is always best to have one of the support, like a tank or a healer, run the ice staves for the brittle debuff and not lose DPS from one of your damage dealers. However, it is still an option, and if you do go that route, you'll keep the gear the same aside from swapping to ice staves, but make sure to have that frost enchantment on the back bar and possibly a charged staff on the front bar as well to ensure really great uptimes. I don't think the charged staff is probably necessary, but it might be the difference in perfect versus near perfect uptimes on brittle. Alright, moving back to the build. For our other monster set options besides Zon, Dome House is really nice in situations where the ring will come into contact with the enemy. Running double crit pieces is also very strong, especially for AoE damage. And then Maw of the Infernal is still pretty decent as well if you have that, but Zon is generally going to be your best bet for single target DPS in places where it's usable. For other good gear options, Medusa instead of Sorrow is still pretty nice to free up a bar spot. One thing I'll note though is that sustain is a bit tougher without casting Barb Trap every 18 seconds, so I typically had to run an Absorb Mag enchant with Medusa to overcome the sustain loss when practicing on the dummy. In an optimized raid scenario, you might not need to do this though. For going Vampire, Siroria and Sorrow, or Siroria and Medusa both work. Sorrow should be slightly better for damage, but Medusa might be a little easier for you with the extra bar space. I did use Medusa on my Vamp trial dummy parse so I could double bar Inner Light and use Heroism potions, but Sorrow is probably the better route in most scenarios. So you'll run a one-piece Slimecraw for the monster set and then a Ring of the Pale Order so that you can reliably heal yourself while using the Simmering Frenzy and Blood for Blood abilities. For non-Siroria setups, I really liked Medusa paired with Sorrow, as you are already getting so much spell damage from Simmering Frenzy, having all that crit chance to go with it worked really well. And it was only about 4k DPS lower on my parse than from the Siroria version. I did swap from the Thief to the Shadow when going with this setup since our crit chance was so high. For other non-trial gear options, again, you could do Medusa plus Sorrow without the Vampire setup. I was still able to get over 90k with that. I also got good results with Burning Spellweave and Mother Sorrow, over 92k with that setup. And again, still with the Shadow since our crit chance is pretty good with the daggers. I'd probably swap that to the Thief though if I'm using a staff on the front bar. And then Sorrow plus Spell Strategist did pretty well too. Spell Strat is only applied to a single target though, so keep that in mind, but it did perform pretty well. And when comparing these damage numbers, do compare them to my 96.4k setup with Siroria, not Wrath's 101k setup. These would probably be a bit higher with his rotation and skill bar setup, but I just tested them with what I had already put the practice in with. And then for kind of a goofy setup, I did try Reliquin paired with Sorrow, and it seemed to do slightly more than the other mag sets aside from Siroria. I probably wouldn't be too inclined to go this route in actual content, but I thought it was funny that this did so well in the trial dummy. Almost 7k DPS from Reliquin on a mag build. Not too shabby. Alright, now I'll go through the different skill bar setups. So this first setup is the heavy dot setup used in Wrath of Enos' parse. You'll notice we don't have a normal spammable ability here, and we just have the semi-spammable in Deep Fissure, but I'll explain how that works when we go through the rotation later. So on the front bar we have Deep Fissure, Fetcher Infection, Degeneration, Blue Betty, Inner Light, and then our ultimate, Eternal Guardian. And then on the back bar we have Unstable Wall, Mystic Orb, Winter's Revenge, Scalding Rune, Barbed Trap, and then again our ultimate, since we do have to double bar that bear ultimate. So one note about this, Barbed Trap can be replaced with Inner Light or whatever other skill you need if you are running Medusa. So for his rotation with this, it is a 22-second static rotation, but we can easily split that into two parts so that it's a little bit easier to digest. So we start with the Blue Betty, Barbed Trap, Deep Fissure, Scalding Rune, Winter's Revenge, Deep Fissure, Mystic Orb, Unstable Wall, Deep Fissure, Fetcher Infection, Degeneration, and then our ultimate. And then for this next part, so the next 9 skills will be an exact repeat of the first Deep Fissure that comes after that Barbed Trap from those 9 skills there. So we'd do the Deep Fissure again, Scalding Rune, Winter's Revenge, Deep Fissure, Mystic Orb, Unstable Wall, Deep Fissure, Fetcher Infection, Degeneration, and then Deep Fissure again. So most of the rotation is the same each time through. Like I said, that 9 skill in a row portion just repeats. You just have the Blue Betty and the Barbed Trap on that first half that you add in, and the ultimate on the end of that every time. So one thing that's good about this rotation is that Deep Fissure is cast every 3rd skill, which keeps the uptime on it really nice. Except for that point when we squeeze our ultimate in, we will have 3 skills cast after the Deep Fissure that time. And then Wrath did make a note to me as well that the dot timings are lopsided here. So we have 12 seconds and then 10 seconds when we cast them. And it is intentional because if you do 11 seconds and 11 seconds on each side, then you lose a tick of degen since it only ticks on even number seconds. And the 10-12 thing also makes the timing much simpler since there's no Shulk's inversion and the same 2 dots always pair up. So just a few extra notes about this. If you are pre-casting Channeled Acceleration before the fight, you can skip that first Barbed Trap the first time through. And then you'll also skip the first 2 light attacks on your initial opening, so on the Blue Betty and Barbed Trap. If you're not casting Barbed Trap there, either you're in Medusa or you already pre-cast Channel Acceleration, then you'll skip the light attack on Blue Betty and Deep Fissure on the first time only. And then at the very end, once there's not enough time remaining to reapply your dots, you'll just cycle through Deep Fissure, Scalding Rune, and Unstable Wall, since these abilities all have hard-hitting direct damage components to them. Alright, this next setup will be the one I used in my 96.4K parse, and it's a less dots version. So this one does have a traditional spammable in Screaming Cliff Racer. You could also use the Vampire spammable here, Elemental Weapon, or Force Pulse, just whichever one you want to put there. And so the reason you'd want to use this maybe over the full dot rotation, even though the dot one can do a little bit higher DPS, sometimes you need a more traditional spammable depending on the fight. Maybe the target is moving often, or maybe side targets come up that need to be focused down quickly, and so it'd be nice to have an actual spammable for those situations. So on our front bar we have Inner Light, Deep Fissure, Mystic Orb, Fetcher Infection, Screaming Cliff Racer, and our ultimate. And then the back bar we have a flex spot, so Inner Light if we don't need anything else there, Unstable Wall, Winter's Revenge, Blue Betty, and then Barbed Trap, and again our ultimate. So Barbed Trap again can be replaced with whatever other skill you need if you're running Medusa. Blue Betty can be swapped to our front bar and Mystic Orb to the back bar, just depending on your rotation preferences and how much you like to bar swap. Mystic Orb can also be replaced with Degeneration if your sustain is poor, which is what I ended up doing on the Trial Dummy parse. So for our rotation with this setup, we'll precast our Blue Betty, Deep Fissure, and the Barbed Trap, and then we'll start our light attack weaving with Unstable Wall, Winter's Revenge, Deep Fissure, Mystic Orb, Fetcher Infection, Deep Fissure, our ultimate, and then 2 of our spammables, so in this case Screaming Cliff Racer. And then after that it's pretty similar all the way through. We'll just keep casting our Deep Fissure and then go to our back bar and apply the Unstable Wall and Winter's Revenge, and then to our front bar again for Deep Fissure, Mystic Orb, Fetcher Infection, Deep Fissure, and then 3 spammables here. So in that place where the spammables are, you will replace one of those with Barbed Trap, Blue Betty, or our ultimate whenever those are ready. So depending on your bar setup, you will have to bar swap back for Blue Betty and Barbed Trap, and then our ultimate can just be hit on our front bar. So a few notes about this. Again, like the last rotation, if you are pre-casting with Channel Acceleration, you can skip the Barbed Trap the first time through. And if you're running Medusa, just drop Barbed Trap altogether. And like I mentioned on the skill setup, you can swap places with the Blue Betty and the Mystic Orb on your bars to make the dynamic section of the rotation require a little less bar swapping, while the static portion of the rotation will have a little more bar swapping. At the very end, when you run out of time to refresh your dots, you'll just spam Deep Fissure and Screaming Cliff Racer, or whatever other spammable you're using. If you do need the sustain help, we'll swap in Degeneration in place of Mystic Orb there. That's what I did on my dummy parse. And then with Heroism Pots, you can cast your ultimate every other rotation in the exact same spot. Without them, you'll need to delay the rotation slightly or cast it every 3rd rotation. All right, this next setup is the one I got 96k with using Medusa, but either of these, this one or the last one, you can use Medusa or Sorrow with them. I just happened to use Sorrow on the last one, and I used Medusa with this one. So our front bar is Inner Light, Deep Fissure, Fetcher Infection, Screaming Cliff Racer, or again, any other spammable you want to use there, Blue Betty, and then our Eternal Guardian ultimate. And then back bar is Barbed Trap, Unstable Wall, Winter's Revenge, Mystic Orb, and Degeneration, and then our ultimate again. So like always, Barbed Trap can be replaced with Inner Light or whatever other skill if you are running Medusa, and then Blue Betty can swap places with Degeneration depending on your rotation and bar swapping preferences. Alright, so the rotation for this one will, again like the last one, open up with Blue Betty and Deep Fissure, and then Barbed Trap, and then we'll start our light attack weaving with Unstable Wall, Winter's Revenge, Deep Fissure, Mystic Orb, Degeneration, Fetcher Infection, Deep Fissure, Ultimate, and then Spammable. And then for the remaining, it's just pretty much the same there, but it's Deep Fissure, and then we'll go to our back bar to apply Unstable Wall and Winter's Revenge, back to the front bar for Deep Fissure, and then to the back bar again for Mystic Orb and Degeneration, then go to the front bar and we'll cast Fetcher Infection, Deep Fissure, and 2 spammables. And similar to the last rotation, the spammable spots there are kind of flex spots, so you'll replace that with Barbed Trap, Blue Betty, or your ultimate whenever those are ready. So you won't be casting too many spammables with this rotation. It ends up being kind of between the last rotation and the dot heavy rotation. So you do get some spammables you can use if you need to change targets really quickly and get something down really fast. So you do have that option there, but it's still a little more dot heavy than the last rotation shown. And then all the notes on this one are pretty much the same as from the previous versions. And again, these will all be down in the description below. And then the last setup we'll go over is the vampire setup. So this is the one I used in my 110k parse. So on our front bar, we have Inner Light, Deep Fissure, Degeneration, or Structured Entropy might be a little better here since it does have a heal on it. And we are required to heal ourselves when using this setup. The next skill is Fetcher Infection, then Blood for Blood, and then our ultimate. The back bar, we have Barbed Trap, Unstable Wall, Winter's Revenge, Mystic Orb, and then Simmering Frenzy, and then our ultimate again. So like all the other setups, Barbed Trap can be replaced with Inner Light or whatever other skill you need if you're running Medusa. So this is what I did. I ran this with Medusa. I double barred Inner Light, and then I was able to run Heroism potions to get my ultimate up a little bit faster. But if you don't want to do that, this could just be a flex spot and for whatever skill you need, or run it with Sorrow and put Barbed Trap there. So like I was mentioning earlier in the gear section, Simmering Frenzy and Blood for Blood both have the component to them where we can't take outside healing. So that's why the Ring of the Pale Order is so important for this setup, because we will be required to heal ourselves through the health that the Simmering Frenzy and the Blood for Blood are ticking off from us, and any other outside damage that might be coming in. It's definitely the high risk, high reward setup, as it's much more dangerous to be in charge of our own heals and to have so much constant ticking of our health while we're also dealing with mechanics. But our spell damage will be insanely high and we'll be able to do a lot of damage with this. So to open it up, we'll cast our Simmering Frenzy. If you want, you can wait a few seconds as well and let it start getting ramped up before you drop your Barbed Trap. And then we'll start our light attack weaving then with Deep Fissure. If you did precast Channel Acceleration to open, you'll wait, start the light attack weaving with Unstable Wall, since you won't be casting Barbed Trap there. And then after the Unstable Wall, we go to Winter's Revenge, then Deep Fissure, then Mystic Orb, then Degeneration, Fetcher Infection, Deep Fissure, our ultimate, and then a spammable, so Blood for Blood in this case. And then for the remaining, it's pretty much the same again, except we have the 2 spammables at the end there. And you might notice this does look a lot like the other rotation. That's because it is very much like the rotation we just went over. We're just using Blood for Blood as our spammable here and trying to keep Simmering Frenzy toggled as much as possible. So most of the notes again here are the same as the previous rotations, but we do have a couple of new ones. So since Simmering Frenzy doesn't use a 1-second GCD like other abilities, you can weave it in at the same time as your other back bar dots. So for example, if you notice it ran off and you're casting a Winter's Revenge, you could light attack, cast the Winter's Revenge and the Simmering Frenzy all within that 1-second GCD. And then for a slightly easier version, you can move Mystic Orb to your front bar and Degeneration spot and drop Degeneration, and then you'll have a little less bar swapping, and you'll also add in an extra spammable in its place. So it'll look just like the less dots rotation here that we saw earlier, except you'll be using Blood for Bloods in the spammable spot there. It does seem like trying to have as many dots as you can sustain is a little bit better, as the more dots you have ticking, the more healing you're doing with your Pale Order ring, and the less likely that your toggle will turn off. But ultimately, just use the rotation that gets you the best results. On to the champion points. So we are going to be slotting Backstabber, Fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim, and Thaumaturge. The AoE one, Biting Aura, is pretty close, and for situations where you can't flank, definitely slot that one over Backstabber. Or for more AoE heavy situations where you can flank, you could slot that over Deadly Aim. And then for a full guide to the new champion point system and where to put your points leveling up, check out my video covering it. It offers some alternate leveling paths as well based around different priorities. All right, that's going to do it for this one. I appreciate you stopping by. A big thanks to my current Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to Nicholas Bonat. If you'd like more info on how you can support through Patreon, I have it in the description below. So I'll go ahead and close this one out with parses showing each of the 4 rotations discussed. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.